Special Delivery by Algernon Blackwood. Meiklejohn, the curate, was walking through the Jura when this thing happened to him. There is only his word to vouch for it, for the inn and its proprietor are now both of the past, and the local record of the occurrence has long since assumed the proportions of a picturesque but inaccurate legend. As a true story, however, it stands out from those of its kind by the fact that there seems to have been a deliberate intention in it. It saved a life the world had need of, and this singular rescue of a man of value to the best order of things makes one feel that there was some sense, even logic, in the affair. Moreover, Meiklejohn asserts that it was the only psychic experience he ever knew. Things of the sort were not a habit with him. His rescue, thus, was not one of those meaningless interventions that puzzle the man in the street while they exhilarate the psychologist. It was a deliberate and very determined affair. Meiklejohn found himself that hot August night in one of the valleys that slip like blue shadows hidden among pine woods between the Swiss frontier and France. He had passed St. Croix earlier in the day. Les Rasses had been left behind about 4 o'clock. Buta in the Val-de-Travers, where the cement of many a London street comes from, was his goal. But the light failed long before he reached it, and he stopped at an inn that appeared unexpectedly round a corner of the dusty road, built literally against the great cliffs that formed one wall of the valley. He was so footsore, and his knapsack so heavy, that he turned in without more ado. Meiklejohn was the name of the inn. Dirty white walls with thin, almost mangy vines scrambling over the door, and the stream brawling beneath shuttered windows with green and white stripes, all patched by sun and rain. His room was 7 pence. His dinner of soup, omelette, fruit, cheese, and coffee, a franc. The prices suited his pocket and made him feel comfortable and at home. Immediately behind the hotel, the only house visible, except the sawmill across the road, rose the ever-crumbling ridges and precipices that formed the flanks of Chasseron and ran on past Le Saunier towards the grey Aiguille de Beaune. He was in the Jura fastnesses, where tourists rarely penetrate. Through the low doorway of the inn, he carried with him the strong atmosphere of thoughts that had accompanied him all day, dreams of how he intended to spend his life, plans of sacrifice and effort. For his hopes of great achievement, even then at 25, were a veritable passion in him, and his desire to spend himself for humanity a devouring flame. So occupied, indeed, was his mind with the emotions belonging to this line of thinking, that he hardly noticed the singular, though exceedingly faint, sense of alarm that stirred somewhere in the depths of his being as he passed within that doorway where the drooping vine leaves clutched at his hat. He remembered it a little later. The sense of danger had been touched in him. He felt at the moment only a hint of discomfort, too vague to claim definite recognition. Yet it was there the instant he stepped within the threshold, and afterwards he distinctly recalled its sudden and unaccountable advent. His bedroom, though stuffy as from windows long unopened, was clean, carpetless, of course, and primitive with white pine floor and walls, and the short bed smothered under its duvet very creaky, and very short, for Meiklejohn was well over 6 feet. "I shall have to curl up, as usual, in a knot," was his reflection as he measured the bed with his eye, "though tonight, I think, after my 20 miles in this air." The thought refused to complete itself. He was going to add that he was tired enough to have slept on a stone floor, but for some undefined reason, the same sense of alarm that had tapped him on the shoulder as he entered the inn returned now when he contemplated the bed. A sharp repugnance for that bed, as sudden and unaccountable as it was curious, swept into him, and was gone again before he had time to seize it wholly. It was in reality so slight that he dismissed it immediately as the merest fancy. Yet at the same time he was aware that he would rather have slept on another bed, had there been one in the room. And then the queer feeling that, after all, perhaps he would not sleep there in the end at all. How this idea came to him, he never knew. He records it, however, as part of the occurrence. After 8 o'clock, a few peasants and workmen from the sawmill came in to drink their demi-liter of red wine in the common room downstairs, to stare at the unexpected guest, and to smoke their vile tobacco. They were neither picturesque nor amusing, simply dirty and slightly malodorous. At 9 o'clock, Meiklejohn knocked the ashes from his briar pipe upon the limestone window ledge and went upstairs, overpowered with sleep. The sense of alarm had utterly disappeared. His mind was busy once more with his great dreams of the future, dreams that materialized themselves, as all the world knows, in the famous Meiklejohn Institutes. Berthoud, the proprietor, short and sturdy, with his faded brown coat and no collar, slightly confused with red wine and a tourist guest, showed him the way up. For, of course, there was no femme de chambre. "You have the corridor all to yourself," the man said, showed him the best corner of the landing to shout from in case he wanted anything, there being no bell, eyed his boots, knapsack, and flask with considerable curiosity, wished him good night, and was gone. He went downstairs with the noise like a horse, thought the curate, as he locked the door after him. The windows had been open now for a couple of hours, and the room smelt sweet with the odors of sawn wood and shavings, the resinous perfume of the surrounding hosts of pines, and the sharp, delicate touch of a lonely mountain valley where civilization has not yet tainted the air. Whiffs of coarse tobacco, pungent without being offensive, came invisibly through the cracks of the floor. Primitive and simple it all was, a sort of vigorous backwoods atmosphere. Yet, once again, as he turned to examine the room after Berthoud's steps had blundered down below into the passage, something rose faintly within him to set his nerves mysteriously a-quiver. Out of these perfectly simple conditions, without the least apparent cause, the odd feeling again came over him that he was in danger. The curate was not much given to analysis. He was a man of action, pure and simple, as a rule. But tonight, in spite of himself, his thoughts went plunging, searching, asking, for this singular message of dread that emanated, as it were, from the room, or from some article of furniture in the room, perhaps. That bed still touched his mind with a peculiar repugnance, demanded somewhat insistently for an explanation. And the only explanation that suggested itself to his unimaginative mind was that the forces of nature hereabouts were overpowering. That after the slum streets and factory chimneys of the last 12 months, these towering cliffs and smothering pine forests communicated to his soul a word of grandeur that amounted to awe. Inadequate and far-fetched as the explanation seems, it was the only one that occurred to him, and its value in this remarkable adventure lies in the fact that he connected his sense of danger partly with the bed and partly with the mountains. "I felt once or twice," he said afterwards, "as though some powerful agency of a spiritual kind were all the time trying to beat into my stupid brain a message of warning." And this way of expressing it is more true and graphic than many paragraphs of attempted analysis. Meiklejohn hung his clothes by the open window to air, washed, read his Bible, looked several times over his shoulder without apparent cause, and then knelt down to pray. He was a simple and devout soul, his self lost in the yearning, young but sincere, to live for humanity. He prayed, as usual, with intense earnestness, that his life might be preserved for use in the world, when, in the middle of his prayer, there came a knocking at the door. Hastily rising from his knees, he opened. The sound of rushing water filled the corridor. He heard the voices of the workmen below in the drinking room, but only darkness stood in the passages, filling the house to the very brim. No one was there. he returned to his interrupted devotions. "I imagined it," he said to himself. He continued his prayers, however, longer than usual. At the back of his thoughts, dim, vague, half-defined only, lay this lurking sense of uneasiness, that he was in danger. He prayed earnestly and simply, as a child might pray, for the preservation of his life. Again, just as he prepared to get into bed, struggling to make the heaped-up duvet spread all over, came that knocking at the bedroom door. It was soft, wonderfully soft, and something within him thrilled curiously in response. He crossed the floor to open, then hesitated. Suddenly, he understood that the knocking at the door was connected with the sense of danger in his heart. In the region of subtle intuitions, the two were linked. With this realization, there came over him, he declares, a singular mood in which, as in a revelation, he knew that nature held forces that might somehow communicate directly and positively with human beings. This thought rushed upon him out of the night, as it were. It arrested his movements. He stood there upon the bare pine boards, hesitating to open the door. The delay thus described lasted actually only a few seconds, but in those few seconds these thoughts tore rapidly and like fire through his mind. The beauty of this lost and mysterious valley was certainly in his veins. He felt the strange presence of the encircling forests, soft and splendid, their million branches sighing in the night airs. The crying of the falling water touched him. He longed to transfer their peace and power to the hearts of suffering thousands of men and women and children. The towering precipices that literally dropped their pale walls over the roof of the inn lifted his thoughts to their own wind-swept heights. He longed to convey their message of inflexible strength to the weak-kneed folk in the slums where he worked. He was peculiarly conscious of the presence of these forces of nature, the irresistible powers that regenerate as easily as they destroy. All this and far more swept his soul like a huge wind as he stood there, waiting to open the door in answer to that mysterious, soft knocking. And there, when at length he opened, stood the figure of a man, staring at him and smiling. Disappointment seized him instantly. He had expected, almost believed, that he would see something unordinary, and instead there stood a man who had merely mistaken the door of his room and was now bowing his apology for the interruption. Then, to his amazement, he saw that the man beckoned. The figure was someone who sought to draw him out. "Come with me," it seemed to say. But Meiklejohn only realized this afterwards, he says, when it was too late, and he had already shut the door in the stranger's face. For the man had withdrawn into the darkness a little, and the curate had taken the movement for a mere acknowledgment of his mistake, instead of, as he afterwards felt, a sign that he should follow. And the moment the door was shut, he says, I felt that it would have been better for me to have gone out into the passage to see what he wanted. It came over me that the man had something important to say to me. I'd missed it. For some seconds, it seemed, he resisted the inclination to go after him. He argued with himself, then turned to his bed, pulled back the sheets and heavy duvet, and was met sharply again with the sense of repugnance, almost of fear, as before. It leaped out upon him, as though the drawing back of the blankets had set free some cold blast of wind that struck him across the face and made him shiver. At the same moment, a shadow fell from behind his shoulder and dropped across the pillow and upper half of the bed. It may, of course, have been the magnified shadow of the moth that buzzed about the pale yellow electric light in the ceiling. He does not pretend to know. It passed swiftly, however, and was gone, and Meiklejohn, feeling less sure of himself than ever before in his life, crossed the floor quickly, almost running, and opened the door to go after the man who had knocked, twice. For in reality, less than half a minute had passed since the shutting of the door and its reopening. But the corridor was empty. He marched down the pine-board floor for some considerable distance. Below, he saw the glimmer of the hall and heard the voices of the peasants and workmen from the sawmill as they still talked and drank their red wine in the public room. That sound of falling water, as before, filled the air. Darkness reigned, but the person, the messenger, who had twice knocked at his door, was gone utterly. Presently a door opened downstairs, and the peasants clattered out noisily. He turned and went back to bed. The electric light was switched off below. Silence fell. Conquering his strange repugnance, Meiklejohn, with the prayer on his lips, got into bed, and in less than 10 minutes was sound asleep. I admit, he says in telling the story, that what happened afterwards came so swiftly and so confusingly, yet with such a storm of overwhelming conviction of its reality, that its sequence may be somewhat blurred in my memory, while at the same time I see it after all these years as though it was a thing of yesterday. But in my sleep, first of all, I again heard that soft, mysterious tapping. Not in the course of a dream of any sort, but sudden and alone out of the dark blank of forgetfulness. I tried to wake. At first, however, the bonds of unconsciousness held me tight. I had to struggle in order to return to the waking world. There was a distinct effort before I opened my eyes, and in that slight interval I became aware that the person who had knocked at the door had meanwhile opened it and passed into the room. I had left the lock unturned. The person was close beside me in the darkness, not in utter darkness, however, for a rising 3/4 moon shed its faint silver upon the floor in patches, and as I sprang swiftly from the bed, I noticed something alive moving towards me across the carpetless boards. Upon the edges of a patch of moonlight, where the fringe of silver and shadow mingled, it stopped. 3 feet away from it, I too stopped, shaking in every muscle. It lay there crouching at my very feet, staring up at me. But was it a man or was it animal? For at first I took it certainly for a human being on all fours, but the next moment, with a spasm of genuine terror that half stopped my breath, it was borne in upon me that the creature was nothing human. Only in this way can I describe it. It was identical with the human figure who had knocked before and beckoned to me to follow, but it was another presentation of that figure. And it held, or brought, if you will, some tremendous message for me. Some message of tremendous importance, I mean. The first time I had argued, resisted, refused to listen. Now it had returned in a form that ensured obedience. Some quite terrific power emanated from it, a power that I understood instinctively belonged to the mountains and the forests and the untamed elemental forces of nature. Amazing as it may sound in cold blood, I can only say that I felt as though the towering precipices outside had sent me a direct warning that my life was in immediate danger. For a space that seemed minutes, but was probably less than a few seconds, I stood there trembling on the bare boards, my eyes riveted upon the dark, uncouth shape that covered all the floor beyond. I saw no limbs or features, no suggestion of outline that I could connect with any living form I know, animate or inanimate. Yet it moved and stirred all the time, whirled within itself, describes it best, and into my mind sprang a picture of an immense dark wheel, turning, spinning, whizzing so rapidly that it appears motionless, and uttering that low and ominous thunder that fills a great machinery room of a factory. Then I thought of Ezekiel's vision of the living wheels. And it must have been at this instant, I think, that the muttering and deep note that issued from it formed itself into words within me. At any rate, I heard a voice that spoke with unmistakable intelligence. "Come," it said, "come out at once." And the sense of power that accompanied the voice was so splendid that my fear vanished, and I obeyed instantly without thinking more. I followed. It led. It altered in shape. The door was open. It ran silently in a form that was more like a stream of deep black water than anything else I can think of, out of the room, down the stairs, across the hall, and up to the deep shadows that lay against the door leading into the road. There I lost sight of it. Meiklejohn's only desire, he says, then was to rush after it, to escape. This he did. He understood that somehow it had passed through the door into the open air. 10 seconds later, perhaps even less, he too was in the open air. He acted almost automatically. Reason, reflection, logic, all swept away. Nowhere, however, in the soft moonlight about him, was any sign of the extraordinary apparition that had succeeded in drawing him out of the inn, out of his bedroom, out of his bed. He stared in a dazed way at everything, just beginning to get control of his faculties a bit, wondering what in the world it all meant. That huge spinning form, he felt convinced, lay hidden somewhere close beside him, waiting for the end. The danger it had enabled him to avoid was close at hand. He knew that, he says. There lay the meadows, touched here and there with wisps of floating mist. The stream roared and tumbled down its rocky bed to his left. Across the road the sawmill lifted its skeleton-like outline, moonlight shining on the dew-covered shingles of the roof, its lower part hidden in shadow. The cold air of the valley was exquisitely scented. To the right, where his eye next wandered, he saw the thick black woods rising round the base of the precipices that soared into the sky, sheeted with silvery moonlight. His gaze ran up them to the far ridges that seemed to push the very stars farther into the heavens. Then, as he saw those stars crowding the night, he staggered suddenly backwards, seizing the wall of the road for support and catching his breath. But the top of the cliff, he fancied, moved. A group of stars was for a fraction of a second hidden. The earth, the scenery of the valley at least, turned about him. Something prodigious was happening to the solid structure of the world. The precipices seemed to bend over upon the valley. The far uppermost ridge of those beetling cliffs shifted downwards. Meiklejohn declares that the way its movement hid momentarily a group of stars was the most startling, for some reason horrible, thing he had ever witnessed. Then came the roar and crash and thunder as the mass toppled, slid, and finally took the frightful plunge. How long the forces of rain and frost had been chiseling out the slow detachment of the giant slabs that fell, or whence came the particular extra little push that drove the entire mass out from the parent rock, no one can know. Only one thing is certain, that it was due to no chance, but to the nicely and exactly calculated results of balanced cause and effect. From the beginning of time it had been known, it might have been accurately calculated rather, that this particular 1,000 tons of rock would break away from the crumbling tops of the precipices and crash downward with the roar of many tempests into the lost and mysterious mountain valley where Meiklejohn the curate spent such and such a night of such and such a holiday. It was just as sure as the return of Halley's comet. I watched it, he says, because I couldn't do anything else. I would far rather have run. I was so frightfully close to it all, but I couldn't move a muscle. And in a few seconds it was over. A terrific wind knocked me backwards against the stone wall. There was a vast clattering of smaller stones set rolling down the neighboring couloir. A steady roll of echoes ran thundering up and down the valley, and then all was still again, exactly as it had been before. And the curious thing was, ascertained a little later, as you may imagine, and not at once, that the inn, being so closely built up against the cliffs, had almost entirely escaped. The great mass of rock and trees had taken a leap farther out, and filled the meadows, blocked the road, crushed the sawmill like a matchbox, and dammed up the stream, but the inn itself was almost untouched. Almost. For a single block of limestone, about the size of a grand piano, had dropped straight upon one corner of the roof and smashed its way through my bedroom, carrying everything it contained down to the level of the cellar, So terrific was the momentum of its crushing journey, not a stick of the furniture was afterwards discoverable as such. The bed seems to have been caught by the very middle of the fallen mass. The confusion in Meiklejohn's mind may be imagined, the rush of feeling and emotion that swept over him. Berthoud and the peasants mustered in less than a dozen minutes, talking, crying, praying. Then the stream, dammed up by the accumulation of rock, carried off the debris of the broken roof and walls in less than half an hour. The rock, however, that swept the room and the empty bed of Meiklejohn the curate into dust, still lies in the valley where it fell. The only other thing that I remember, he says, in telling the story, is that as I stood there, shaking with excitement and the painful terror of it all, before Berthoud and the peasants had come to count over their number and learn that no one was missing, while I stood there, leaning against the wall of the road, something rose out of the white dust at my feet, and, with a noise like the whirring of some immense projectile, passed swiftly and invisibly away up into space. So far as I could judge, towards the distant ridges that reared their motionless outline in the moonlight beneath the stars.